Auburn, Massachusetts, March 16th, 1926. The fields were still frozen from winter, the air sharp and dry. A handful of men stood around a strange metal frame propped up on a tripod. Beside it, a thin man in a wool coat checked the valves and wires with steady hands. His name was Robert Goddard, and what he was about to do would change the world forever, though no one watching could have guessed it. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a general. He was a quiet physicist who believed that one day humans would touch the stars. He had spent years working alone, building crude rockets in barns and fields, with only his wife and a few students to help him. His neighbours called him a dreamer. Newspapers called him insane. Rockets in space, one headline laughed. A waste of taxpayers' money. Yet Goddard refused to stop. He believed that the only way to break the limits of Earth was to harness fire itself, to make it propel humanity beyond the atmosphere. That morning, he ignited his latest experiment, a small liquid-fueled rocket standing barely 2 meters tall. The motor sputtered, coughed, and then came alive. With a roar that echoed across the empty field, the rocket lifted off. It climbed just 41 feet into the sky, arced gracefully, and crashed into a cabbage patch 184 feet away. It had lasted 2.5 seconds. To the world, it was nothing. To Goddard, it was everything. It was the first successful flight of a liquid-fueled rocket in human history. But the world didn't celebrate him. The press mocked him again, calling his invention a science fiction fantasy. Even the New York Times published a headline ridiculing his belief that rockets could one day reach the moon. They claimed he lacked the basic knowledge of physics. The irony that would echo decades later when astronauts finally read that same article on their way to the moon. Goddard never replied publicly. He simply went back to work. His mind was consumed by calculations, thrust, velocity, combustion ratios, numbers that no one else at the time could understand. He tested hundreds of fuels, building rockets in secret, often paying out of his own pocket. At a time when nations spent fortunes on battleships and tanks, one man was shaping the future of humanity in a small shed behind his home. He wrote, "It is difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow." Goddard's obsession began long before that historic day. As a boy, he had read The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells and spent hours staring at the sky, imagining machines that could leave Earth's gravity. When he was 17, he climbed a cherry tree near his home and gazed at the horizon. In his journal, he wrote, "On this day, I made my life's purpose, to make human flight beyond the Earth a reality. But the world was not kind to dreamers. His funding was limited. He worked at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and later at Clark University, sneaking into his lab at night to test engines. His early prototypes exploded, burned, and failed. His lungs were scarred by fumes from his experiments. Yet each failure pushed him further. Each explosion brought him one step closer to understanding what no one else dared to attempt. By the 1930s, the shadow of war was spreading across Europe. Most scientists were turning their attention to weapons. Goddard remained focused on the sky. He believed rockets could explore, not destroy. But fate would soon pull his work into the orbit of war. Before that could happen, he made one last move, to Roswell, New Mexico, in 1930. The open desert was perfect for testing. There, under the blazing sun, he launched dozens of rockets that broke altitude records. He pioneered gyroscopic stabilization, fuel pumps, and engine nozzles still used today. He wasn't building toys anymore. He was building the foundation of modern rocketry. But while he worked in silence across the Atlantic, a different kind of engineer was rising. His name was Wernher von Braun, and he would use Goddard's forgotten ideas to arm Nazi Germany with the V-2 rocket, the first weapon to reach the edge of space. The irony was cruel. The man who dreamed of reaching the stars was being overshadowed by those who used his dream for destruction. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. so we can keep uncovering the minds that shaped our world. Question: how many dreamers throughout history changed everything, yet were never believed until it was too late? Roswell, New Mexico, summer 1935. The desert was endless and dry, a sea of sand and sagebrush stretching to the horizon. Under the blazing sun, Robert Goddard worked in near isolation, surrounded by crates of fuel, tangled wires, and a few trusted assistants. His hands were burned, his lungs still damaged from earlier tests, yet his focus never wavered. The desert had become his laboratory, his exile, and his cathedral. He called it a place where ideas can fly without being shot down. Each day began before sunrise. Goddard adjusted valves, checked combustion chambers, and recorded temperatures. When the countdown started, there was only the sound of wind and the ticking of his stopwatch. Then a blast. A thunderous roar that sent a pillar of fire and smoke into the desert sky. His rockets now soared thousands of feet higher than before, each one carrying the lessons of failure from the last. He was no longer just experimenting, he was proving that flight beyond Earth was possible. But no one was watching. The world was too busy preparing for war. Newspapers no longer mocked him, they simply ignored him. His government offered little funding, and his university colleagues dismissed his work as impractical. Yet, in the stillness of the New Mexico desert, Goddard made discovery after discovery. Liquid fuel pumps, gyroscopic stabilization, and nozzles capable of controlling thrust direction. The same principles would later drive the rockets that took humans to the moon. In one test, he launched a rocket that climbed 9,000 feet and reached speeds close to 700 miles per hour. The sound echoed across the plains. Locals sometimes thought he was testing military weapons. They weren't wrong, at least not entirely. While Goddard himself was a man of peace, the science he was perfecting would soon become the backbone of modern warfare. In 1938, as tensions rose in Europe, reports began to circulate of German engineers experimenting with similar rocket designs. Unknown to Goddard, his own research papers, publicly available in the US Patent Office, had been translated and studied by German scientists, including a young engineer named Werner von Braun. The Nazis had taken what America ignored and turned it into a weapon. Goddard's dream of exploring space was being reshaped into a nightmare. Meanwhile, the US government continued to overlook him. When Goddard wrote to the military offering his expertise, the War Department thanked him politely and declined. They didn't see any practical military value in rockets. They were focused on airplanes, tanks, and ships, the technologies of the present, not the future. It was one of the greatest missed opportunities in scientific history. By the early 1940s, Goddard's health was deteriorating. His constant exposure to fumes, his exhaustion, and the relentless stress of underfunded research began to take their toll. Still, he kept pushing forward. His wife, Esther, documented his work with photographs and detailed notes. She often said he looked less like a scientist and more like a man fighting a war, not against another nation, but against disbelief itself. In one of his journals, Goddard wrote, "Every vision is a joke until the first man accomplishes it. Once realized, it becomes commonplace." But the joke, it seemed, was still on him. In 1942, news reached him from Europe. German rockets had struck London. The V-2 had arrived, a missile capable of flying into space before falling at supersonic speed to the ground. To the Allies, it was a terrifying new weapon. To Goddard, it was proof that he had been right all along, and that others had used his genius first. American intelligence reports after the war would reveal that von Braun and his team had based much of their early rocket design on Goddard's patents and publications. His name was known in Peenemünde, the Nazi Rocket Research Center. German scientists reportedly called him the American pioneer. But in his own country, his achievements were buried under secrecy and neglect. In 1943, after years of indifference, the US military finally contacted him. The Navy wanted help developing jet-assisted takeoff technology for aircraft. Goddard accepted. Not for fame, but because it was finally a chance to make his work useful. He developed a series of small rocket boosters that allowed planes to lift off from short runways. They called them JATO units. Jet-assisted takeoff. And they would become vital for carrier-based aircraft. For the first time, Goddard's work was saving lives instead of being ignored. Yet, he knew his time was running out. His body was failing, his funding still uncertain, and the war was consuming everything. In his final years, he grew quieter, more reflective. He often stared at the sky in silence after each launch. Those who worked with him said he rarely smiled anymore. Only when the rockets fired perfectly. In July 1945, as the world celebrated the end of World War II, Robert Goddard died of throat cancer at the age of 62. He never saw humanity reach space. He never knew that his calculations would form the foundation of every rocket engine built after him. He died believing he had failed. But history was already beginning to shift. As Allied forces captured German technology, American scientists found blueprints and notes referencing one name over and over, Goddard. His dream had survived him, just not in the way he imagined. If you're still watching, remember to subscribe and like. It helps keep stories like this alive. Question: how many inventors throughout history built the future only for others to take the credit? 1945, the war was over, but its technologies were just beginning to speak. Across Europe, the battlefields were silent, yet beneath the ruins, entire vaults of knowledge waited to be unearthed. In laboratories hidden under mountains, the Allies discovered machinery and diagrams unlike anything they had seen before. Blueprints for rockets that had crossed the edge of space, fragments of engines, gyroscopes, and valves marked with precise measurements. And among them, one name appeared again and again, R.H. Goddard. The American intelligence teams were stunned. They had been tracking German rocket development for months. Yet now they realized the core principles had already been published, not by a Nazi scientist, but by an American physicist, who had died in quiet obscurity less than a year earlier. Goddard's patents, once ignored in Washington, had been translated and studied in Peenemünde years before. His theories on liquid propulsion, fuel injection, and guidance had formed the unseen skeleton of the V2 program. When engineers from the captured German teams, men like Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and Arthur Rudolph, were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, they were astonished to learn that the man who had inspired them was barely recognized in his own country. Von Braun himself would later admit, "We learned more from Goddard than we did from anyone else." But history, as it often does, favoured the victors. The headlines celebrated the German scientists who now worked for the US Army, not the quiet American who had made their breakthroughs possible. Von Braun became a celebrity, the public face of the new American rocket program. Goddard remained a footnote, the ghost in the equations. At Clark University, where he had once been dismissed as a dreamer, professors began quietly reviewing his notes. They were stunned by what they found. In Goddard's meticulous handwriting were detailed calculations for multi-stage rockets, gyroscopic steering, and even the concept of reaching the moon using a series of orbital boosts. He had predicted space travel decades before the technology existed to attempt it. Meanwhile, in the deserts of New Mexico, the same region where Goddard had tested his rockets, the US Army built the White Sands Proving Ground. It became the birthplace of the American missile and space programs. The same skies that once carried Goddard's small prototypes now thundered, with captured V2s launched under American control. Military engineers began to recognize the eerie familiarity of the designs. It was Goddard's logic, his geometry, his fuel ratios, the same science now weaponized on a national scale. For Esther Goddard, his widow, it was bittersweet. She watched as the very ideas her husband had once been mocked for were now the foundation of America's new frontier. She dedicated her life to preserving his work, archiving thousands of his documents and photographs. It was thanks to her that his name didn't disappear completely. In 1951, the Smithsonian Institution finally took notice. They published a report acknowledging Robert Goddard as the first man to develop a rocket operating on the principle of continuous propulsion by liquid fuel. It was official recognition, but years too late. Still, the echoes of his work spread far beyond museums. The US Air Force adopted his stabilization systems. The Navy refined his fuel injection models for missiles. NASA's forerunner, the NACA, quietly used his research as the mathematical foundation for the transition from atmospheric flight to near-space trajectories. By the mid-1950s, the space race was beginning. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, and the United States was scrambling to respond. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory, untold, founded on theories Goddard had pioneered, became the heart of America's rocket efforts. Every engine that fired, every launch that pierced the stratosphere, carried pieces of his legacy. Engineers began to refer to certain design ratios as Goddard parameters. His fingerprints were everywhere, even when his name wasn't. There's an unspoken irony in how science advances. Sometimes progress isn't made by those in power, but by those who worked in silence, only to be rediscovered when their time is gone. Goddard's story became a lesson whispered in laboratories and universities. The future belongs to those who see what others refuse to believe. By the late 1950s, as von Braun appeared on television promoting America's new space ambitions, a few older scientists in the audience would shake their heads quietly. They remembered the man who started it all, alone in a Massachusetts field, with a rocket that barely reached a cabbage patch. The difference between ridicule and glory, it seemed, was not genius. It was timing. Goddard had always known this might happen. In one of his final writings, he reflected, "The dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow." He was right. The rockets that once crashed into gardens were now piercing the stars. Question: why does history so often wait until a man is gone before it realizes he was right all along? 1960. 15 years after his death, the world that had ignored Robert Goddard was now racing toward the stars. In laboratories, once filled with the noise of war, new machines hummed quietly. Satellites, boosters, and guidance systems built on the same principles Goddard had tested in his backyard. The impossible had become routine, and for the first time his name began to echo beyond the laboratories that had once dismissed him. It began with a decision inside a small office in Washington, D.C. The newly created National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was preparing to establish a major research center dedicated to propulsion and spaceflight. The agency's administrators, many of them young scientists who had grown up reading Goddard's old reports, agreed there could be only one name for it. On May 1st, 1959, NASA officially announced the founding of the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. The announcement marked more than an institution. It was a public apology, written in steel and concrete. The man once mocked by newspapers and dismissed by generals had now become the symbolic father of the organization that would send humanity to the moon. For his widow, Esther Goddard, it was a moment of quiet justice. When she stood at the dedication ceremony, surrounded by engineers in crisp white shirts and ties, she whispered, "He would have smiled at this." Inside the new center, his influence was everywhere. Engineers studied his handwritten notes preserved by Esther. Line after line of equations about fuel injection, stability, and thrust optimization. Many of those same principles would shape NASA's Atlas, Mercury, and Apollo programs. His early ideas about gyroscopic control directly informed the systems that guided astronauts through the blackness of space. It was as if his mind had stretched decades ahead and left behind a trail of calculations for others to follow. In 1961, when President John F. Kennedy announced his goal of landing a man on the moon, Few realised that the mathematics supporting that dream had already been written in the 1920s by a man no one believed in. His equations had become prophecy. His dream of flight beyond Earth was no longer fantasy. It was national policy. The irony, however, never fully faded. Many of the engineers who made the space race possible were trained under German scientists brought to America after the war. Von Braun became a household name, smiling beside politicians and presidents. But behind every design, behind every engine test, behind every diagram of thrust and trajectory, Goddard's original framework persisted. Quietly, the engineers of NASA began to refer to him as the first. One of them, engineer John Paul Stapp, once said, "If we are climbing to the stars, it's because Goddard built the first rung of the ladder." It was an acknowledgement spoken not in ceremony, but in truth. Beyond the symbolism, his legacy reached deeper. In 1969, when Apollo 11 lifted from Kennedy Space Center and headed toward the moon, the telemetry data and propulsion readings passed through systems based on Goddard's concepts. At Greenbelt, the control center that bore his name relayed the signals that guided humanity's first step onto another world. In that moment, his dream, born under the Massachusetts sky and forged in the New Mexico desert, had finally arrived. After the Apollo triumph, NASA named a crater on the moon after him, Goddard Crater, a permanent mark on the surface he once imagined humans would reach. His name, once printed in ridicule, was now carved into the heavens. And yet, what makes his story remarkable isn't the eventual recognition. It's the unwavering conviction that carried him through decades of doubt. Goddard never built for applause. He built because he believed in something larger. The idea that knowledge itself was sacred, that progress had its own gravity, and that curiosity was worth the ridicule it brought. At the Smithsonian, his original rocket, the small, fragile prototype that once flew above a cabbage patch in 1926, was restored and displayed. Children looked at it with the same wonder he must have felt when he stared up at the sky as a boy. The sign beneath it read, "The world's first liquid-fueled rocket." No mention of mockery, no laughter, just history. By the late 1970s, his legacy had evolved beyond national borders. His patents had become international references. Space agencies from Europe to Japan cited his equations. Even the Soviet scientists who had once raced against NASA acknowledged him as the true origin of modern rocketry. In classrooms around the world, students began learning about Newton, Einstein, and Goddard. The story of Robert Goddard became something more than science. It became a lesson in persistence, in faith, in the stubborn endurance of a dream. He had no army, no fortune, no institution behind him, only vision. And it was that vision that lit the fire beneath humanity's greatest journey. Question: how many revolutions in history began not with power or politics, but with one person, alone, daring to believe that the impossible was simply the future arriving too soon? 2023, nearly a century after his first rocket roared above a frozen field in Auburn, Massachusetts, the world he once imagined has become reality. Rockets rise not in secrecy, but in celebration, watched by millions across the planet. Spacecraft cross the solar system. Telescopes capture the birth of galaxies. On every launch pad, on every control screen, somewhere in the numbers lies the signature of a man who never lived to see his vindication. Robert Hutchings Goddard, the dreamer the world once laughed at, is now the reason humanity looks beyond its own sky. From NASA's Goddard Spaceflight Center, engineers track probes traveling billions of miles through the dark. The hum of computers, the flicker of telemetry, the synchronized voices counting down through headsets, all descend from his single conviction that a controlled explosion could become a bridge to the stars. The center that bears his name has become one of the beating hearts of exploration, a monument not of marble, but of mathematics. Every time a rocket clears the tower, whether it's NASA's Artemis, SpaceX's Falcon Heavy, or Blue Origin's New Shepard, it carries within it the same fundamental principles Goddard wrote by hand: liquid propulsion, staged combustion, gyroscopic stabilization, thrust vectoring. The science has evolved, but the skeleton remains his. Even private space engineers and billionaires and startups alike walk paths laid out by a professor who once soldered pipes together in his workshop with borrowed tools and blind faith. What sets his story apart is how fragile it was. Goddard wasn't protected by fame or fortune. His experiments could have been erased by one more accident, one more denial of funding, one more year of ridicule. And yet, against all odds, his vision survived, passed quietly through time, from one curious mind to another. That's how science often works. Not through glory, but through persistence. There's something poetic in that. The idea that the same Earth which once ignored him now trembles beneath machines built from his equations. The world that once mocked his ideas now depends on them. Every GPS signal, every weather satellite, every spacecraft searching for life beyond our solar system owes a debt to his quiet rebellion against disbelief. Historians call him the father of modern rocketry. But to those who know his life, he was something more, a man who refused to let reality define the limits of imagination. He built not just machines, but faith. Faith in progress. Faith in reason. Faith that curiosity itself could change the fate of a species. At the Smithsonian, under a glass case, his first rocket still rests. 25 kilograms of wood, metal, and history. Next to it lies a small brass plaque engraved with one of his final quotes. "It is difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow." Visitors stop, read it, and look up, the same way he once did, at the endlessness above. And in that moment, Robert Goddard lives again, in the sound of the engines, in the shimmer of fire against the sky, in the trembling of air before a launch. His genius wasn't the metal or the mathematics, it was his refusal to stop believing when everyone else did. So much of what we call modern science began as the stubbornness of one person who refused to give up. He never wanted fame, he wanted truth, and that's what he left behind. The rockets of the 21st century are no longer bound to nations or wars. They carry telescopes, satellites, and dreams. Humanity's gaze now extends beyond the moon, toward Mars and beyond. But the roots of that vision trace back to one workshop, one mind, one man who dared to light the fuse. Robert Goddard didn't just build rockets. He built the courage to believe that we could rise higher than we ever imagined. His flame still burns. In every engine, in every launch, in every dream that begins with the words, "What if?" If you believe that one idea, even from one person, can change the world, share this story. And if you want to uncover more forgotten pioneers who shaped our future, like the video, subscribe, and help keep their legacies alive. Question: if Robert Goddard could see how far we've gone, would he finally feel vindicated? Or would he tell us that our greatest journeys have yet to begin?